Hey friends, welcome to episode 530 of the My 123 Cents podcast. I am your host, Kevin Huntsberger. Thanks for joining via audio or on YouTube. If you are watching this week, you see I have a very special guest. It is an anniversary this week of the show called Main Event from All American Pro Wrestling, a show that I have talked about on this show before, and a good friend of mine, Chris Hagstrom, who has been here before. But Chris, we're going to do a deeper dive on Main Event and AAPW. And brother, you are all decked out there. So talk to us about what's going on there with your ensemble this morning.
The after the explosion of the gnome, which I'm sure many people have heard the story about the broski gnome, I thought it was only fitting to go in my full broski outfit today. Zack Ryder was part of that big explosion during our glory days, shall we say, of professional wrestling. So felt only appropriate, but I don't think I can do an entire interview in sunglasses, brother. So we'll do our best without.
Well, let's talk, because like I said before, we have talked before about All American Pro Wrestling and specifically Main Event, but there's other factors and things that happened that night and what led up to it. But I want to kind of get more of a backstory. Talk to me about your fandom. I think there's probably about 10-ish years between us, age-wise. I'm 10 years older, so I feel like you probably came up and became a wrestling fan, I'm going to guess, during the Attitude Era, but I'm going to let you kind of tell your story of what brought you to the table as a wrestling fan.
It was the 90s and wrestling was exploding thanks to the NWO, just becoming in mainstream culture, pop culture, just on the cusp of the Attitude Era. Again, being a middle school student, everyone was talking about wrestling and NWO, so I was like, well, I got to check this out. And so WCW was the show that I started with. That was the territory of the wrestling program. And I was instantly transfixed by just the theatrics of wrestling. Not necessarily the moves, but the stages, the pyro, the pageantry. I mean, that was what drew me in. And being my favorite wrestlers at the time, Sting, just this guy that didn't talk. I mean, I never even saw Surfer Sting until I went through the archives and watched previously. So it was Crow Sting that really drew my attention. It's just fascinating in psychology and so that kind of grew. And of course, I kind of bordered back and forth between WWF and WCW, as all kids do. Stone Cold Steve Austin being the driver there. But really, what flipped me, as I'm sure many people my age did, was the Tony Schiavone saying, Mick Foley's going to win the title. That'll put butts in the seats. And I flipped over and never flipped back.
Wow.
So that was my start. But had a chance to see a lot of great shows. The WrestleMania 18, my friend Greg and I, we went up to Toronto to see WrestleMania 18, and various pay-per-views in Chicago has always been a great market when it comes to watching Raw. I actually had never been to a WCW show. As big of a fan as I was, I never went to a show because they were always at the United Center and the tickets were always tough to come by. So never saw a WCW show, but it was great to go to those shows at the Rosemont Horizon / Allstate Arena.
Yeah.
And that just kind of grew from there. And when I went to college, I actually had the chance to be a professional wrestler. There was a very small group that ran in Olney, Illinois. That was the late great Bud Chapman. He had a wrestling school down there. And when I was a freshman in college, I don't remember where I saw the ad. It was just, I saw an ad somewhere about, do you want to be a wrestler? Come to school. Josh Totten was just training at the time as well. Homicidal Stephen Davis was one of the trainers. And so for a few months, I was training to be a wrestler. And then there were just some personal things going on that I ended up going back home for about a couple months, taking a little break from college. And then when I came back, I was just kind of all in on media and production and things along those lines. But that wrestling itch always stayed with me. And the first ever time I actually stepped in the ring was at a show in Mason, Illinois.
Okay.
I was never actually a wrestler at the time, but I was security. And then Lucky Dane, who some people may know in Southern Illinois, He always had a box of Lucky Charms with a horseshoe in it. Well, that was his gimmick, and he hit you with a box of Lucky Charms, knock you out cold. Well, I worked security for that show, and just got the heck kicked out of me. And the funny thing with that I remember was the dressing room was actually up a flight of stairs,
Okay.
in this gym that we were at, and so when I was knocked out and to sell, like they literally had to drag me upstairs,
Oh, wow.
and I just kind of remember my feet hitting and dangling
Yeah.
and whatnot there. And then my first actual, and I'm sure we'll talk about this a little bit later on with AAPW. The first time I actually ever interacted with them, I didn't know it at the time, was a show at Sports Blast. Now it wasn't AAPW. I'm sure if you remember the show, I think it had Disco Inferno, Rick Steiner,
Yes.
Jazz, um,
Was Billy
a
Gunn
few
on
others.
that show?
Billy Gunn was on that show,
Yeah.
and so that was when he came on your show to help promote.
No, Billy Gunn actually had come on for an Ian Rotten show. I was out of town for the show that
Oh,
you're
okay.
talking about, but a friend of mine who is kind of a casual fan, but he works at one of the local banking facilities here in Southern Illinois. They were sponsoring that show, and so he actually got to go to it. They sat front row, and then they ended up hanging out with some of the wrestlers, Billy Gunn being one of them, later that night. So that's how I recall that show. But
Nice.
how did you, okay, so, and you said you went to college, so obviously that was here in Southern Illinois at SIU
Mhm.
Carbondale. What year was this that you were kind of getting here and doing this training? Because kind of trying to set the timeline and the table for what indie wrestling looked like in the I'm guessing this is early 2000s, right?
Yeah, it was 2004 was when I
Oh,
first started training. I got
okay.
down in 2003. And then that Sports Blast show was 2006. I was
Yes.
actually working for a local radio station down in Southern Illinois at the time. And I contacted the promoter, saying, hey, I'd love to have somebody on the radio show. And then they asked me to be the ring announcer.
Okay.
So it was pretty cool to actually be the ring announcer for that. And that was my first chance of really, truly stepping inside the ring.
Hmm.
Um, and it's funny enough, and we could talk about it later on, I've got a photo that I had no idea who these people were, but there was a photo of Edmund Livewire McGuire
Okay.
and Josh Totten and a few of the other local AAPW stars. Axe Allward with the long yellow hair that he was rocking at the time.
Yeah.
I had no idea who these people were, but I wanted to get a photo, and it's kind of funny. I'll try to track that photo down and send it your way.
Yeah, please do. So our timelines again are very similar, age-wise, not so much, but the time coming to Southern Illinois and kind of discovering wrestling. I moved here in January of 2004. And when I moved here, Chad Smart and I have talked about it many times around the podcast. He was one of the first people that I met at the TV station that I was working at, and he was a big wrestling fan. And there were a handful of other people at the station who were wrestling fans, and they would go. And I think this was before, or it might have been around the time that AAPW All American Pro Wrestling was being coined as that. But they would talk about these indie shows, and I had never been to an indie show at that point. I had only been to WCW, NWA, and WWF house shows. I went to Starrcade '90. That was the only pay-per-view I'd ever been to. So I'm kind of new to the whole indie scene and wasn't really sure what to expect. And we started going and having fun. And Chad and I, we actually bought wrestling masks, and we would sit in the crowd and just kind of be goofy, dumbass fans, basically. And then he moved away, and I tried to introduce my kids to it. And so I take my boys, we went to it. I know it was an AAPW show. I've got pictures of them with Axe in the ring. And again, I think Axe Allward has probably made one of the biggest transitions in independent wrestling, at least here in Southern Illinois, from look wise. And he's
Mm-hmm.
just a few years younger than me, and I'm no spring chicken. And he is in phenomenal shape. He's recovering from an injury right now, but he is still getting in the ring and kicking ass on a monthly basis. So kudos to Axe. I love Axe Allward, but he is just one of those guys that has that personality and that character. So obviously you're a fan, you're getting involved. I think the difference between us, because you are definitely much more outgoing and personable with people, and I am very introverted because I wait for people to come to me and you, I feel like, are that go-getter, because I would have never dreamed of doing anything on the wrestling scene until, I did the ring announcing the one night with Ian Rotten's promotion back in 2005. But then I lay dormant for 6 years until you came a calling with AAPW. So how did you though go from, you trained for a little bit, you obviously were into the media and doing the radio stuff and production. So you're kind of building up a many different talents that you could bring on and bring to an independent company. So how do you go from fan to then becoming a part of the show to eventually becoming the executive producer?
Well, for me, it was all thanks to the local baseball team at the time, the Southern Illinois Miners. They were my first job out of college, and this is like at the height of my wrestling fandom. I'd been to many different shows at the time, and I'm like, hey, we've got to have a pro wrestling night. We've got to have, it's popular in the area. People would come out, help support baseball, and tie the two together. So when I was in charge of our marketing promotions team, we put together in 2009 Pro Wrestling Night.
Okay.
Well, with that, we were trying to find some way to enhance that night, and so I did some research, and All American Pro Wrestling was the local promotion around here. So I had reached out. I want to say maybe via MySpace, which
Yeah.
tells you how long ago this
Right. I
actually
was going to
was.
say, because Facebook wasn't, I mean, it was starting to get popular, but it
Mhm.
wasn't like it is obviously today. So yeah.
Yeah, it was through MySpace, and I had reached out to Sean Mockabee, who I didn't know obviously at the time, but I reached out to the AAPW page, and we got connected, and we talked a little bit about what we could do, and we said, hey, let's bring in Pro Wrestling Night, and so we had the first Pro Wrestling Night that year, and one of my favorite memories, it actually rained that day,
Mm.
so the game I can't recall the game if it got played or not, but I remembered the pregame stuff with the wrestling ring in right field. I was doing the ring announcing for it. I ended up having Axe Allward and his name is escaping me. The guy that Axe had teamed with, and I'll obviously look it up later on. With Gaylord Stevens, of course, in tow.
Sure.
They were a tag team, and I ended up getting pushed by Axe, and then his teammate then started choking me, rolling out of the ring. That's what I remember of that one. And then I remember interviewing serial thriller Shane Rich on the concourse. It was such a fun night. That was in 2009. So that was a lot of fun. Nothing really materialized much. Sean and I stayed in contact a little bit. Then we had Pro Wrestling Night Volume 2, which was in 2010. That's where we brought in Jerry the King Lawler. We wanted to have a little more star power to the show. So Jerry
Was that
Lawler
during the
comes in.
day?
Yeah, it was a afternoon
Okay,
where we
I
had
was at,
the
that's the one I went to. So I remember this show specifically because you were ring announcing for that too, I believe.
Yep, and I was getting my retribution on Axe because Mike Masters was doing his baseball gimmick at the
Yeah.
time.
Yes.
And so they come out, and there's a photo that has Mike Masters holding Axe and me with this big swing coming up. You're going to slap the taste out of his
Yeah.
mouth to get my retribution there. But that was a lot of fun. And that was when we seriously started talking more and more about what we could do. Potentially, Sean invited me to be a ring announcer for a show. I think it was the fifth anniversary show for the American Cancer Society, or it might have been the fourth anniversary show.
Mm-hmm.
But that was in October. And that was when we seriously started talking because it was 2010. I was transitioning jobs. I was going from one of the last things that I did in 2010 was had that pro wrestling show at the Miners. I took a job at Southern Illinois University, Carbondale, as a director of video services. So all their athletics production. And this is before the time where it's easy today to stream. Everybody's streaming everything.
Right.
But streaming was just at its infancy, and there was no student productions. Everything had to be done professionally.
Mm.
Well, they wanted me to come in and bring students to teach them so they could run the new cameras at the arena and the brand new football stadium.
Okay.
And it was my job to have those students come up with a final exam. Well, the fall, we were still figuring some stuff out and trying to figure out their final exam ended up just being video segments. But I had the idea after the anniversary show about what if the final that they had for the spring semester students was doing taking everything they've learned, take it out of their element and put them in something brand new.
Hmm.
And that's where the idea of doing a wrestling show came about. They would we'd use the studio, just like the old, Chase
Hmm.
wrestling days, where in
Yeah.
St. Louis they would record in a television studio. We'd have them in one of the studios. The students would take what they've learned and shoot it, edit the matches, everything like that. So this is probably the winter of 2010.
Okay.
I talked to Sean. He's coming up with some stuff, and and I don't quite know how this came about, but Sean had connections with the Golden Boy Greg Anthony,
Okay.
and that was when the Golden Boy, if we're pulling the curtain back here at this point, I think that's the whole point of this podcast. Golden Boy had the book.
Yeah.
He was booking the show, and so he booked the AAPW show that was going to be taped in April of 2011. Um, Students came in, we put the ring together. Curly had the ring, so he
Okay.
brought it in, he backed it in, we set it all up in the studio. Um, we put together a little of all the stuff we had backstage at the studio. We put a little ring set together. I had a sign taped up and made from our friends at the printing company or the printing plant in Carbondale. It was pretty cool. It was just one of those, like, I can't believe this is actually happening.
Hmm.
We're bringing a wrestling show into the studio. The students taped it. They had so much fun doing it. Me and the wrestlers backstage, kind of seeing the behind the scenes and how stuff was getting put together. It was pretty cool. So April 2nd, 2011, this event happens. The studio is packed. It was just a wild, raucous atmosphere. We have the event. I'm like, wow, this is. I remember standing in the ring as the crowd is going crazy. I'm just kind of like, wow, this is kind of cool. This
Yeah.
is this is captivating. Uh, Nothing in my head at the time ever thought about TV at this. This was just students taping, having a chance to take what they've learned and apply to something new.
Hmm.
Well, after seeing their segments, their finals, I'm like, what if, just what if we could put on a true televised wrestling show?
Hmm.
Um, and I never would have thought to do that, except about, I'm guessing by that point in time, it would have been 10 months ago, my mother passed away.
Hmm.
It was very sudden and uh, had a lot of emotions, obviously, but it was something that I had a hard time dealing with.
Hmm.
But with that, there was, my mom had saved up quite a bit of money, and being the only child and my parents being divorced, just everything went to me.
I got
And I'm thinking to myself, I've got all this money laying around, and obviously I could invest it.
you. Hmm.
But I wanted to do something that I know my mom would have been proud of, and it's try to help others with it. And if this show was really going to take off, you need financial capital for it.
Sure.
And so that's where kind of the money side of it came into play.
Hmm.
So I'm talking to Sean, I'm talking to Golden Boy, like, this could be something, guys. This could be a televised show. Southern Illinois hadn't had local wrestling on for years and years and
Yeah.
years. And that's, again, I think at that point in time, after these were all taped, that's when you and I connected with you.
Hmm.
It might have been on MySpace as well. Could have been,
I think it
I
was a
forget how,
Facebook message.
might have been Facebook at
Yeah.
the time. Yeah. So then that's when I contacted you, and being at the TV station you were at,
Hmm.
um, trying to make the connection. How could this be possible? How can we quote unquote, sell this?
Hmm.
So then I got in touch with the sales folks at the TV station, and I'm very curious on your thoughts, because I know you and I have had conversations about the distinction between Kevin Huntsberger, the reporter, versus Kevin
Hmm.
Huntsberger, the television character.
Yeah.
And but I talked to the sales folks. They're like, well, if you're gonna, basically you're buying airtime. So if you want the show, great, but you've got to spend X amount of dollars
Hmm.
per show.
Yeah.
So that's when we got the green light and said, hey, you guys can put on a show.
Yeah.
Um, and so I talked to you about helping us tape, and all the fans that don't know, all of the first two episodes we taped in at my house, my duplex, where we just dubbed it after the fact.
Yeah, because Chad and I were in Atlanta for WrestleMania that year when
Mm-hmm.
you recorded the show. You guys had come on, and I want to say I can't remember if where the wheels in motion were at that point, but you and Mike Masters and Heath Hatton had come on to the morning show to promote the taping.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the infamous chair shot to Mike. He came in and was jaw jacking Tyler or Keith Hatton. And so we knew that it was coming. And I think at that point, I don't know that it was necessarily going to be a TV thing, but you were going to probably try to put it on YouTube or do something with it, because you were selling it as a taping. So to help your students, as you mentioned. So I do
Mm-hmm.
remember that part of it. And then getting back from Atlanta and coming to your apartment. And like you said, you were able to split it into two segments or two shows. So we did the voiceover work from there. And, there's not a whole lot of difference between Kevin Huntsberger, the news anchor, and Kevin Huntsberger, the wrestling commentator. I didn't do a whole lot, and nobody ever really. I always took the approach of it's better to ask for forgiveness than permission. And so if I would have gone to my boss at the time, and I'm not going to name names, you know who it is, and if I'd have gone to him and said, "Hey, we're going to do a segment on the morning show tomorrow, and a wrestler's going to come in, and I'm going to hit him with a chair," it would have been stopped dead in the water, and we would not be sitting here today probably doing this podcast about this.
Mm-hmm.
So I just kind of let everything ride and just kind of did it, and uh, and this was in the early days, like I said, of social media. So people would comment and say things. Never once did anybody say this is stupid. Why are you doing this on so it never got like negative viewer feedback. So I think they were all kind of cool with it. And I didn't I'm taking 3 minutes of a 90-minute newscast. So it wasn't like I was as overselling it or anything. And we were giving fair time to other groups and organizations. And whenever we could sell it as you're wearing the pink t-shirt, for example, for the cancer show. So when we could tie in the community service side of things, that always helped
Mm-hmm.
as well. So that was
But
always my
also, Kevin, with your show, I hate to interrupt, but
no,
with the
no,
morning show, that was always meant to be fun and lively. I mean, this is the same show where you got tased on live TV.
right. Yes. Yeah, exactly. So we were doing things, but again, for whatever reason, and I was going to kind of ask you about this too, how you were able to sell this to the students. And I think maybe they were probably more open-minded about it, but there's a lot of people, even today in 2025, who view pro wrestling as hilljack or redneck or, hillbilly and, low class or whatever. And so I feel like if I'd been doing something with, I always compared it because I had some colleagues that were theatrical and they would go and perform at McLeod Summer Playhouse and I'm like, there's no difference here. It's all entertainment just in different forms. And so if I were painting a picture and putting it on a display and talking about it on the show, there'd be no problem. So it was kind of changing that mindset with pro wrestling. And I'm going to get ahead of myself here or ahead of our conversation. But when I had the match later, 6 to 9 months after we started the show, um, I was told, do not do that again. You are not to wrestle again. And that was in 2012. 2018 rolled around and I had the second match and I didn't say a word about it. I just did it, because again, I'm the ask for forgiveness instead of permission kind of guy, but it was not um, widely accepted or respected or thought very highly of amongst my colleagues and bosses. But like I said, it was more ask for forgiveness instead of permission for me. So that's why we proceeded and moved forward with it, and it ended up, in my opinion, being worth the risk. So
And I took the same mentality with SIU. I mean, I had to, just because of the studio, I had to get the right, connections and approvals for those types of things. I remember Mark Wetstein was I believe, not necessarily stage manager was his title, but he was basically in charge of the studios. And I had told him about this idea, and he had no problem. He's like, sure, just make sure that anybody signs a waiver. So I think all the wrestlers had to sign a waiver about protecting the studio, and if anything happened to them while they were here, it's not our fault.
Now,
Um,
did you have to
so
did Sean carry insurance with the
yes,
wrestling company itself? Yeah.
yep, and obviously later on I would carry that as well. But yeah, you always had to carry a certain type of insurance by owning the ring, and
Hmm.
when we got into Black Diamond, the same thing. Everybody had to see the proof of insurance
Yeah.
for the ring. So, um, but the students had no problems with it. They were actually excited.
Yeah.
There was some of them were wrestling fans. Others didn't quite know what to expect. But at the end of the day, we taped it. We put it together. It looked pretty cool, and it was in May, about a month later, once all this was taped and we had the um, audio track down, that's when I really was able to sell it to WSIL, show them
Yeah.
the footage, and they said, sure, you can do, let us know how many episodes you wanted to do, and that's when we got with Golden Boy Greg Anthony, who again had the book,
Yeah.
and like how do we want to do this? Where are we going? It's like, let me get back to you. And so it was maybe a day or two later. He had just all these ideas. I'm not sure if he wrote them down in a book, a literal book of his, or
Uh-huh.
he had all these different storylines on how we can take, because that first episode, those first two episodes, really, that was just showcasing the talent.
Right.
There was no true storyline developed behind it, and it wouldn't be until Sports Blast in the summer in July when we'd have a true roadmap of, okay, here's where we're going to take the show. Here's where these long-term storylines are going to be created. Um, and it was, I remembered, I remembered the setup, but maybe you can shine some light onto you and Mike Masters. When did you first know that that was going to be, a story, that the whole Mike Masters scenario was going to be a story?
You had come back in on the morning show after the chair incident, which was, I would say, in early April, maybe late March, to promote the taping, like we said at SIU. You would come in again, and I don't know if we were promoting the Sports Blast show. I think it must have been the Sports Blast show. And there was another interview going on that morning. So I had come off the set. My co-anchor was doing that interview, and you and I were talking before our segment. And you had said then, uh, what are your thoughts of getting in the ring and wrestling? And I was like completely dumb. And I'm like, there's no way, because again, growing up this skinny, awkward, geeky kid, I thought the best I'll ever be able to do in wrestling would be, be a manager type or something. And so I never even gave it a second thought. But you planted that seed, and then you said, we'll talk more about it as we get closer. And then I believe it was at that Sports Blast show, you and Golden Boy, and I think Mike himself too, because I'm like, nobody's going to want to put
Mm-hmm.
over this, pushing 40-year-old news anchor who's never been in a wrestling ring other than to announce. So, but yeah, it all came together. I think that Sports Blast show is when it all kind of started coming together. And this again is in July, and we're road mapping 6 months ahead, which is what I love about the story aspect of things, where I think a lot of wrestling fans today, and I don't want to get into a whole AEW WWE debate, but obviously WWE has been around for many, many, many decades and is sports entertainment. There is success involved with the storytelling, whereas AAPW, I think, still kind of struggles because they don't have those definitive stories that are going on. And so I think one of Golden Boy's attributes, kudos to him, is he was able to put together a lot of great stories and build them up to this big show that we're going to eventually get to, our WrestleMania, if you will, of that very first main event. So that's when I found out was right before that Sports Box show.
And I do remember you saying, like, no one's going to want to see this. You
Mhm.
were very adamant about, thinking this was going to be a simple early show match. And
Yeah.
the Golden Boy, again, I don't think he ever has been given enough credit for what he did for that first season. And I'll talk about it later on my thoughts on what happened after main event.
Mhm.
Um, but he doesn't get enough credit because he has that Southern style storytelling, that really draws people in. It may not necessarily be the high flying, the acrobatic, the jaw dropping, but it was stories that you could relate to, that people would get behind. Um, and he saw in, his mind, he's like, this is money. He saw that people wanted to see this, and you're playing to your audience at that point. We weren't really going for the national spotlight. We would get it thanks to two, well, really four amazing stars that were on the show,
Hmm.
but we were going for the local aspect, and having you in that sub main event, um, really you could have closed the show if you're talking about actual um, fan reaction. No disrespect to Axe and Ed, they put on a phenomenal match, and we'll talk about these matches. But you could have closed the show, and really after what happened after main event, that or at the end of your match, we probably should have closed the show.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
we'll talk about that.
Yeah, unfortunately. But yeah, Golden Boy, and he is still to this day involved in pro wrestling. And the interesting thing I found with him too was, he was from Tennessee, the Dyersburg area. He's still with Pro Wrestling Mid South and wrestling and doing things with them. So he wasn't really even a local guy per se, as far as knowing this market and knowing who I was or what may or may not work. So I appreciate the fact that he had a vision and was willing to take a risk and a gamble, and Sean, of course, for doing it, and you for being kind of the, I mean, let's face facts. Without you and your crew for one, but then also the financial support of it, again, we wouldn't be sitting here having this conversation, I don't think.
Yeah, and I think that was, we'll again maybe get to that a little later on. That's kind of one of the reasons why I'd gotten out of it. But
Mm-hmm.
it was, we were riding a high. I mean, we finished taping Sports Blast. All the stories were in motion, and then Sports Blast financially wasn't going to work.
Yeah.
Talking about those financials, it was a great venue. We could have continued working there. Everything was set up, ready to go for us, but um, they wanted too much money for what I thought that we could run shows at. And so I can't recall how I got in touch with Mark Rady, and I think it was with Black Diamond. I think it was through sponsorship. I was trying to find local sponsors for television to help sell the airtime to
Mm-hmm.
offset some costs. So then I got in touch with them. I think I reached out via email, and their marketing guy, I talked to a little bit about this. And the Black Diamond is known for, especially at that time, they were very edgy when it came to their marketing.
Yeah.
I actually forgot about the spots when I was watching main event yesterday to get prepared. There's a couple of TV spots in there that you can't run today with how they were put together. Then the character I'm talking about, the little lady and
Yeah.
with the cigar in her mouth. You
Yeah.
can't run that anymore.
Exactly. Wow. Yeah.
But so I talked to them, and while they were supportive of the idea, the fact they didn't have again a lot of money to give to it, but they could give us the warehouse
Mm-hmm.
and to help offset some costs. So again, thinking about it in those financials, okay, well, they may not necessarily be putting money into the show, but hey, we're saving a lot of money by being able to use the warehouse, and that's why we moved into the Black Diamond Arena. I remember touring it. I can't recall if you were there, Kevin, or
I
not.
don't think I was there initially. No.
I'm like, wow, it was so ECW-esque
Mm-hmm.
by just looking at literally just an empty warehouse where they would store their bikes.
Yeah.
And so like this is perfect. So we would bring in Curly's ring, it was Curly's ring at the time. And I think it was actually during that first season when I actually bought it from him
Okay.
because there was a lot of time to bring it back and forth and stuff like that. So we were able to leave the ring at the warehouse in the corner.
Yeah.
And then we had shows that were taped in it was August, September, and October. Um, Actually, no, I think it was October, November, December, because we had taped a few different things, and it was actually September because it was the Davey Richards incident,
Mm-hmm.
which I completely forgot about. We were trying to. Well, I'll finish the story about the warehouse. I can ramble all day, but we get to the warehouse, and we set up, and I got the photo of the first time we had set up all the chairs. Like, this is such a cool setup. it was so like this is the start of something really big.
Yeah. And so, obviously there are a lot of costs involved with a wrestling company. We have seen here in Southern Illinois, companies come and go, and it takes that commitment and that dedication and that time to make things work and happen. And especially now when you add in production costs and television time, talent costs, because if you're running a local independent show and you're just using your local talent, it's a much different look, budget wise, I think, than if you're bringing in a Davey Richards or Pac or El Generico, and we'll get to those guys in just a few minutes. But the Davey Richards incident was an interesting aspect of this. But I also want to talk a little bit to you about, because I feel like Adam Testa kind of became your right hand man with some of this as well. And when did he get into the fold? I know he worked at the local newspaper, the Southern Illinoisan, at the time, and photography was his skill set. So I feel like there were several of us that just kind of had specific or some skills that we were able to kind of bring to the table and make this kind of work and use our talents, and not necessarily, obviously you were doing the financial and using your talents as a producer and director, but Adam came in as your photographer. And I want to say that was at the Sports Blast show, but I could be wrong. He may have been at that SIU show as well.
He might have been at the SIU show, but I didn't actually make connection with him until Sports Blast. And then really just kind of he wanted to help wherever he could. And of what I recall, it was a very gradual friendship that developed from that, and he'd come by and help out, just very much similar to Drew and Nathan when they were just fans at the show, and we eventually became into bigger roles. But it was very gradual, that he would come in, he'd help with photography and help promote and just talk wrestling. That was a lot of what we did. We would just talk about what was happening in WWE or what we were planning and some of these ideas. And incredibly thankful to Adam for what he brought. And when you look, you can see him on almost every scene of Main Event, because he was standing right there next to the ring entrance and to help with the crowd. I mean, it being our first DVD taping, you wanted the crowd to be loud and you wanted them to respond at the right times and say the right things. So Adam was always there to make sure that happened. And his role obviously grew as AAPW grew, and we went into our other wrestling venture. And it was, from what I read, because Main Event itself was such a blur for everything that was going on at the time. But just having Adam, just again starting out as a photographer was phenomenal. Just to have that friend and develop that friendship. And he never asked for any money. It was just him wanting to help.
Yeah. Well, and this isn't a dig at anybody, but those early days, especially, we would get there, the three of us, and Aaron Heller was there a lot of the times too. I could count on one hand how many people were usually there or set up. And you're not just talking about setting up the ring. We're also setting up studio, dressing rooms for the boys to change, and obviously we do that, but then also setting up rooms for promo recording, making sure that the crews are here. And we'd get there at 8 a.m. on show day, and I would be getting home, obviously after tearing everything down and whatnot, and then we'd go to Steak and Shake. That was kind of our go-to place, but it'd be 1 a.m. usually before we would get home and be done for the day. So it's a long, long day and very arduous in what is going on. And because it is a TV taping and you're telling stories, and there are so many elements that have to come in to play. And then you see sometimes where maybe WWE or AEW has continuity, because it's a lot going into all of these efforts to put this together. And again, it wasn't a huge money-making venture either. So you're doing all this more as a labor of love and a passion project than it is to get rich quick kind of mentality. And I think sometimes people forget that. They think, oh, you're on TV, you must be rich. And that was certainly not the case doing local news. And it certainly wasn't the case with producing local wrestling either.
Yeah, there was money was never a thought behind it. I never
Mhm.
had thought we were going to make money from this. It was passion project, and I even forgot the folks for the the ring entrance. Soundcore would come in, and they'd set up the steel trussing that
Mhm.
we'd use for the entrance, and I think I want to say it might have been Golden Boy. I can't recall who actually said this, but somebody said, "Why don't you have the boys set the ring up?" Because that's what you did as a
Mhm.
independent wrestling. You'd go in, all the wrestlers would come in early to set the ring up. Well, the thought process being we needed the ring set up early, and so the
Yeah.
wrestlers aren't going to get there that early to set a ring
Right.
up, where we have to then all the other technology and things set. I wanted stuff ready to go. Timing was always my big thing. I always wanted things to stay on time. I always wanted to open doors right on time. I wanted to start the shows right on time.
Mhm.
That's always who I've been.
Yeah.
And don't forget, we also had to grab the barricades from SIU. That was something
Yes.
that was always a chore, to get those metal barricades. Again, everything looked great. It was such a, again, part of what made our show stand out from anybody else was it was a professionally looking show.
Right.
We made sure that it looked like it was supposed to, like it was a an ECW style show.
Mhm.
And there was a lot of work that had to go into that, which had hurt some relationships and things for me at the time,
Mhm.
because all my time is being spent in the editing room of setting up the shows, working my regular job at
Right.
SIU. Everything, basically, wrestling consumed everything that wasn't my day job.
Yeah.
So a lot of blood, sweat, and tears went into putting that first season on because we didn't quite know how everything was going to look and what it was. Just really, like I said, the four of us, the brain trust, if you
Yeah.
will. That was kind of how all that came together, and we set everything up. And so when the boys are coming in, they're like, "Oh wow, this is so cool!" Like they're walking in, with big eyes, not
Mhm.
realizing how much work went into that.
Yeah. So at what point did you figure out with Sean and Greg that we were going to build up to this main event show and do, and again, context is king for time wise. This is 2011 going into 2012. So DVDs are very much still a real thing. WWE Network has not been born yet. So we're not to that level of streaming, but we were putting shows on WSIL TV on Saturday mornings one week, and then the next week we would supplement that with a YouTube show. So YouTube's still kind of growing and getting its legs and building up. But as far as DVD sales, companies, IWA Mid South, for example, that's where I was doing some of my first things in wrestling was with them and their DVDs and whatnot. So everything is still very much a tangible. I want to hold this DVD in my hand, and obviously you had a vision for that. But when did you guys come together and realize, okay, in January we're going to do this show, and that's going to be our big for lack of it's called main event. So how did you get to that date?
Um, Greg always had the thought that the payoff was going to be on a big show.
Mm-hmm.
We always had to have the storylines were going to pay off on a big show. And we had settled on, after episode 13, I think it was, in January, we were going to have the payoff show. There was really not a thought. Nobody had talked about it being a DVD specifically, but it was just that's going to be our big payoff for everything. And what's even funnier, too, was the October AAPW taping, which ended up being 10 and 11. That was when the Mike Masters versus Jay Spade for you
Mm-hmm.
wrestling came about. We never had the title of the show main event. There was no show name, and we're talking about the promo that Mike is going to cut. He's like, so how do I phrase this? What are we building to? And we knew the date was January 14th,
Mm-hmm.
but we never had the name of the show. And so literally the name of the show came out through our commentary. We said,
Okay.
I said main event. You know, Mike Master, when he hit his promo, he had nothing. But when we were talking during the match, that's when I just said, I made the executive decision. We're going to call it main event because
Okay.
it just came out. And that's
Yeah.
how the name of the show came to be.
Okay. I did not know that. That's cool. And I don't want this to come off sounding negative at all because it all worked the way it worked and ended the way it ended. The one nitpick as a wrestling fan that I had with the build up to that was the fact that my guy for the match was Jay Spade, because Jay had also been on a big losing streak. Jay hadn't won any matches either. So that's my one critique of everything. But Jay is a good friend now, and I've actually wrestled Jay a few times and wrestled with Jay a few times. So but yeah, that again, it was very surreal, because I'm like, I couldn't believe that this was happening, and I couldn't believe that people wanted to see it, and that Mike Masters was so agreeable to doing this and whatnot. But when you get to know a lot of wrestlers, and I've had an opportunity to meet a lot who have been on the big stage, who have been on the indie scene and whatnot, and for the most part, they are all going to do what is best for the story and do what is best for, I hate to steal the phrase, but they'll do what's best for business. And so Masters was one of those guys. And again, I tip my hat to him, but to everybody behind the scenes, because like you said, we're building these shows and doing these shows to build up to Main Event, which was on a Saturday night. And we aired a show that Saturday morning on WSIL that, if you watched Saturday morning, you were walking in Saturday night knowing, okay, this is what's happening, and you're caught up and you're ready to go. And I love that part of it too, that continuity, again, that was so important in storytelling, of no matter what you're watching or doing. So that continuity and that storytelling was always consistent and spot on that first season, especially to lead up then to Main Event. So talk to me about Main Event and that day, and obviously big stars coming in from the independent wrestling scene, and all the getting those guys convinced and to be a part of the show too. So talk to me a little bit about how all of that came to be, and then obviously we get there that night.
So that's actually probably a little bit longer story, but I'll try to shorten as best I can. The Greg had his whole plan for Main Event. It ended up being, it was going to be 6 matches, a really great show. And then I was reached out. Colt Cabana actually had reached out to me.
Okay.
He had said, "Hey, I've got we're doing this show in Chicago the night before, and I'm bringing all these guys are coming in with being El Generico, Pac, and himself." So he said, if there's any interest, I'm like, absolutely. I'd love to, because they were flying in from Japan.
Okay.
That was the thing, was Pac and Generico were flying in from Japan after they were finishing a show. So they were already going to be in Chicago. They were going to do a show there, and then they were going to come down and do a show with us.
And for people who don't know, let's do some context.
Sure.
Had you talked to Colt before, or was this kind of a cold call on his end?
I had talked to him before
Okay.
about something else, about potentially trying to come in, because he was big on the Indies at the time too. So he was going to be our guest star for Main Event.
And we're in Southern Illinois, and people think of Illinois and they think Chicago. So obviously they're all coming from Chicago, but it's not like hopping in the car and driving for an hour or two. It's what, 5-6 hours between Chicago and where we were doing the show in Marion, Illinois.
Yeah,
right?
It's a 5-hour drive from Chicago, from downtown Chicago.
Okay.
And again, originally it was just going to be Colt Cabana was going to be the special guest for Main Event.
Yeah.
But then he had talked about Pac and Generico were coming in to do this show in Chicago. I'm like, absolutely, I'll pay their fee. It's not as bad when you think about from the financial side of things. Let's do it. Well, I get a call from Colt. This is, hey man, the Chicago thing fell through. And this is after we already promoted having Pac and Generico.
Yeah.
We said, hey, they're going to be on the show. So then he says the Chicago guy, it fell through, and it's, they're in Japan, they don't have a flight. And so I'm like, what am I going to do? We've already promoted this huge international match, which I had to sell to Greg, because originally Greg just wanted the local talent, but like, hey, I was selling him, telling, hey, this is going to be a big thing. It's going to be, put us on the map. Okay, if you want to do it, you want to spend the money, we can do it. So then after all that convincing and saying, hey, we can do the show, we can bring these guys in, they're not going to come because they don't have a flight. It's like, what am I going to do? I have to bring them in. Like I was so sold on we could have done some creative editing and worked around it, but like this, I had a vision for how big AAPW was going to become at the time.
Mhm.
We had just debuted on TV in September. People were really talking about it. We were getting a lot of eyes, and so I was like, well, I guess I'll pay the airfare, which was I think well over 5 grand
Holy shit,
to
I
get
did
them.
not know that.
Yeah, to get them from
Wow.
Japan, that was a lot of money.
So
Um,
did you know then that this was going to be a DVD show?
by that point, I did.
Okay.
We'd finally realized this was again. I think it was October, maybe early November,
Uh-huh.
when we found out, and we we were going to for sure make this a DVD. I'm like, this is going to put us on the map. We
Mhm.
have to do this. And so I don't mind saying this part. You can cut it if you want, but um, the show was run by Billy Corgan. He was running an independent show
Okay.
in Chicago. Billy Corgan was the one that said, "No, I'm not paying the airfare." Well, after I ended up paying the airfare to bring them in, then Billy Corgan rebooked them, so he didn't pay any of the
Wow.
airfare. And so I have a grudge with Billy, and he has no idea who I am. He has no idea what I was doing, but I have a grudge with Billy Corgan to this day because he owes me 5 grand.
I did not know that. I knew that I didn't know who the promoter was. I knew that somebody uh you know backed out of the deal and whatever. I did not know it was Billy Corgan. That's wow. That is
Yeah, it was
that's
Revolution Pro Wrestling was the company he was working with, and I
okay.
know they're not around. They weren't around for very long, but yeah, every time I see him now working with whether it was with TNA or wherever he goes with I
Mhm.
now IAW or IWA
Yeah,
NW I'm sorry NWA it's
yeah,
NWA he's working with.
NWA, yeah. Wow.
Yeah,
Okay. I did not
I'm like
realize that.
he's gonna be the death of that company.
Yeah. Well, and I'm not editing this out, so because it's part of the story and it's something that I think is very interesting and fascinating. So yeah, so we get Pac Generico. How did Matt Cross come into the fold?
That was another Colt Cabana. He's like, hey, Matt Cross is going to be in town. Do you want him to come down too? And at that point, it was actually I think Adam Testa that sold me
Mm,
on M Dog because I was like, we already had enough, and Testa, it's like, no, it'd be really big to have him. And so again, I'll go to Golden Boy because I don't want to step on the Booker's toes.
right.
It's like, hey, M Dog is now coming too. Can we get him in? And so that was kind of the start of the booking, I don't call it fiasco, but that's how things started changing with that. And I've got thoughts that we'll talk about after the main event and how that happened. But asking, hey, can we bring this person on? Can we bring this person on? And so it was just Colt was asking, and like, yeah. So that's how we got all four of them. Colt kind of started the whole process, and on the day of the show, those guys could not have been any more generous. And I know we've told the story before about
Mhm.
the Pac and giving up his chair in the locker room
Yeah.
because we had sold so many tickets, we had sold out of all physical chairs that we had. That we had to give up chairs in the locker room, and Pac, took his chair and gave his chair away to a fan that wanted it. So
Hmm.
it was, the day of was so nervous,
Yeah.
and I'm sure we'll get to that point. But yeah, those guys could not have been any more gracious with their time. And looking back on that match, it was amazing that we even had it on the show.
So yeah, so obviously uh we didn't do pre-sales, I don't believe, for that. That was all walk up, or did we have pre-sales back then?
We did do pre-sales. That was
Okay.
you could buy them at the Black Diamond sales floor, so you could go to Black Diamond and get your
Okay.
tickets. We didn't do online sales. I think you only had to get them at Black Diamond. And they had sold maybe in advance, maybe 120 tickets, which
Hmm.
at the time we thought, hey, this is pretty good,
Right.
because we were drawing about 75 to 100 for a collision taping.
Hmm.
So we already had 150 sold. Like, okay, that's pretty good. But then the walk up just that day was people just kept streaming in
Hmm.
to the warehouse, and I look out and like, wow, there's like literally there was no space left, And so I had to go to Mark, the warehouse manager, like, hey, can we put people up where you guys put the bikes? And we had to make sure it was secure and safe. But he said, yeah, that's fine. As long as we have these bars up here to keep people protected and safe, we can do that. So we then literally started pushing people into the balcony, the rafters,
Yeah.
which brings your famous line, which we stole obviously from
Gorilla.
Gorilla Monsoon. They're literally hanging from the rafters, which
Yeah.
created then our radio show.
Yeah. Well, and that was um I remember getting a text from some of my fraternity brothers who lived in St. Louis or live in St. Louis, and they're like, look up. And I looked, I didn't know they were coming, and they're standing there. And so to me, that was like a holy crap moment, because it's like people were coming from out of town to be a part of this show, and to see this show. And I think that a lot of the people that were coming out of the St. Louis area were coming for Pac and Generico, obviously, but it was just surreal, because I was doing commentary for the first half of the show, and then at intermission went back and started getting ready. So I'm in my head while I'm doing commentary, I'm also thinking ahead to how is this going to look, because again, as we pull the curtain back, Mike and I did not really talk much. We didn't prepare. That afternoon when he got there is when the first time we really kind of talked about things. I mean, I knew how it was going to end, but all of the stuff to get there, I had no clue. And so I just remember being a nervous wreck. For one, wondering what the crowd's going to be like, but then once the crowd's there and seeing it, then it's like, holy shit, this crowd is here now, and they're here to see this, and we want it to look as good as possible. So it was a nerve-wracking day on my end from that regard, but from your end, I'm sure, with the financials involved with it, but then also taking that gamble, taking that risk, because Golden Boy wanted to go one way with just having more of the local talent, and then you're convincing him to bring in two, for sure, guys who were not originally supposed to be a part of the show, three, I guess, with M Dog. So yeah, that it was just a culmination of things that I feel like, at least in that moment, everything kind of fell into place and felt right from my perspective. And I know that and that's kind of what we're talking about, is some of the more behind the scenes things that I wasn't privy to. But let's talk a little bit more about that night, and then get into the fallout from it.
Yeah, the day of, there was just so much prep work that was going on. Obviously, our normal setup, and that was when we actually had changed the ring setup too. We wanted to, instead of using the back, if you're looking at the hard camera, instead of using the back right side for the entrance, we then moved the entrance to the left to give it a little more space, make it look a little more grander. Because then we added the big banner to the left that would become a staple of season two.
Yeah.
It really gave it a more of a true polished look. Logistically too, for the wrestlers, where they could be in that little back corner. And we had room for production equipment and being able to have a backdrop where we could do promos and take photos. And the production just kept getting elevated more and more. So we needed more space, and it ended up working out that way. And so we're getting all this set up. We're now taking promo photos for season two. We've got Jason Wilkie, who was a phenomenal photographer for us at the time. Wes Bennett, God rest him, was there as well as a photographer. Brian from Missouri Wrestling Revival was there. Like, the journalists and the folks that helped promote these shows all came out to the show, this
Right.
main event show,
Yeah.
because of how big it was, because of the stars that were on there, and how we were gaining traction and things were slowly building up. I was a mixed bag of emotions, just because of, again, the financials, number one, something Sean and I had talked about prior to that, which we'll talk about after, knowing what was to come, and then just the payoffs, and knowing how this stuff was gonna take place. So I was just a nervous bag until I walked through the curtain, and fans are just losing their shit. I mean, they're just going loud and crazy. And it's not on the DVD, but it's on a tape that I have, that the cameras are rolling. Of course, we make our entrances as an announce team. Just there's like a little glisten in my eye because I was so happy. I was bringing tears to my eyes
Yeah.
with seeing how successful that was. And then of course yourself and Serial Thriller, who's joining the commentary team, Shane Rich. Um, and so then we sit down and it's showtime. I mean, we're ready to go. Um, I will say I hate my commentary.
No.
I, I look back at that and I just talked too much. I didn't let the as I'm watching these DVDs back, again, hindsight is 2020.
Sure.
I'm trying to tell stories and tell the how we got to here and tell the backstory for the folks that probably have not watched Collision.
Hmm.
But I'm stepping on you and Shane trying to talk, and I was just so overcome that I just the first half was tough for me to listen to because I just felt like I took away from the show.
Well, and I don't agree with you on that, but is it a challenge because you are, back in the day when I was watching wrestling initially, Vince McMahon was doing the commentary for Superstars of Wrestling, which at that time I didn't know that he was the owner of the company and the one that was kind of driving those stories. So it made sense for him to be out there. But did you find it nerve-wracking because there were you were kind of it as far as that being the voice, but then also kind of making sure that the technical stuff was going, because you didn't have a TD, you didn't have anyone that was kind of calling shots or punching cameras or anything like that. So you're going to then in your mind you're watching this show as the commentator, but then you're also watching it as someone who's going to now have to go back and edit all this and put it all together. So does that add pressure to your performance as far as that goes? Because I think sometimes when we get nervous or when we're thinking or preoccupied, maybe we talked a little bit more than we should, and maybe that's where some of that came in from your side of things.
I think you're absolutely right. We never had a video switcher to do these shows. Everything was taped on a DV tape locally on the cameras. And
Mm-hmm.
then in post, I would go in, time sync all the angles. The
Mm-hmm.
hard camera would be on line one, line two would be camera two, line three would be camera three. And then I would just literally go through and cut um, the angles we wanted to. So when there was a big move, we'd cut to a different camera so it'd make that move look even bigger. You could see that on it's pretty much wrestling production 101 today. You make those moves look bigger when you cut on the move.
Mm-hmm.
And then adding our commentary track to sync that up as well. So there was no one behind the scenes that actually that's directing and cutting cameras live. Everything's done in post. But you could see it on the DVD too that I'm also running the audio board
Yeah.
at
Yeah.
ringside. So when there's during your match, I mean, I'm literally trying to talk to you and be the character, but I'm also trying to make sure the audio is
Mm-hmm.
being picked up and you can hear us through there. And whenever we do the replays, when you watch the DVD, there's no replay back on a monitor.
Right.
I'm literally just in my head thinking, how am I going to cut this? And
Yeah.
they say, well, let's take a look at the replay. And that's my cue to put the effect in post. And then
Mm-hmm.
just whatever I'm talking about is how we do the replay. So that's
Yeah.
how we ended up doing those. So again, adding to those nerves, like, okay, I have to make sure that I'm remembering what just happened correctly so then I could put it in post and then I have to match what I'm saying in post production. So then there was that element to it as well. So yeah, I mean, at this point I trusted my camera operators. That was never a concern.
Mm-hmm. Right.
The monitors that we had, the left monitor was a little hardwired to camera three, and the other monitor was a hardwired to camera two. So we were always seeing, especially during the 5-pack challenge, when we couldn't see on the other side of the ring,
Yeah.
we had to rely on the monitors. We're looking at these monitors that are just a literal, the cable is a hardwire directly into that monitor so we could actually see what was going on.
How long did it take you to edit that? Do you remember?
Oh gosh. I know that, and there's even some mistakes that you could still see in there, like a bug doesn't dissolve off the way I want it to. It took me weeks to get that done, but it was probably 3 weeks
Mm-hmm.
of all my free time
Yeah.
was just to that,
Yeah.
just so I can get it done right and put
Mm-hmm.
the DVD together. I think by the early February, I think we were mass producing those DVDs. I had the master 2 copies, and then I would take it to the RT building, and they had a DVD copier where I could just insert one DVD, and then you put 10 DVDs in the tray, and it's burning all those copies.
Okay.
So you're putting all the stacks of one to the side, and you're putting the label on it. And again, Adam Testa was a huge help. He designed the box art. He designed all the labels that we used for it. But yeah, it probably took me a good 2 to 3 weeks to get that done. But we were trying to push it hard and push myself hard so we can get them out there to sell.
Yeah, absolutely. And so how did, because obviously it's a different time. Social media is still, like I said, in its infancy for the most part. I mean, some people are obviously relying on it and using it, not like it is today, 13 years later. But how were sales? Did you feel like was the juice worth the squeeze, so to speak, as far as the time and the effort and the financial cost? And I know you probably obviously didn't make back the money that you spent on that flight, that unexpected flight for Pac and Generico, but was it worth the squeeze, do you think?
I think so.
Hmm.
We ended up selling out of the first run of DVDs, which was great. Um, the I think I probably could have done another run, but then we were heavily involved in season two
Hmm.
by that point in time. So I was busy focused on editing that, and I probably should have made another run of DVDs we could have kept selling. We just I was so focused on other things that I didn't think about main event and that being such a um, unique experience that we could have kept on living. And I still have all the files, and
Hmm.
I probably could do another run, or I know I've put the matches on YouTube at this point. So,
Yeah.
um, I think it was worth it to get. You take the airfare out, we probably came close to breaking even. I know for sure. Um, I don't know. I probably would say I came close to breaking even if you take the airfare out, but still,
Yeah.
just because of all the extra cost didn't make money. But that was such a lightning in a bottle show to
Hmm.
where you look at every single match on that card. I completely forgot about M Dog and his match because of how much is on there
Yeah.
until I'm sitting back there watching the DVD. So the first match, of course, is Golden Boy and Heath, and so much credit I give to Golden. I don't think he gives enough credit, and I'm trying to give him a lot of props here
Sure.
because he was the booker and he could have booked himself in the main event. He didn't. He
Yeah.
booked himself in the opening match against a rising star in Heath Hatton, who would go on to have bigger and better things in season two and what would have been season three.
Hmm.
Um, because he saw the talent in Heath
Hmm.
to what he could do. So Golden Boy, they had a great match. It was more of a technical affair with a couple of spots there. Then you go into the M Dog Poker Face match, which again was more high flying. There was more of that indie wrestling style to it. Um, then you've got the 5 pack challenge, which was no offense to the performer, but I remembered the match and I remember the spot that Jay did. I didn't remember much of the match after that. I was like, oh yeah, there's Bull Bronson. Oh yeah, there's Justice.
Yeah.
Um, then of course you have the match right after that where it was supposed to be Convoy against the Money Making Jam Boys, but Roscoe's partner didn't show that day or was ill or had something come up, so Bull had to fill in and pull
Hmm.
double duty that night.
That's
So
right.
Bull comes in and does that, and then the Madman, again, God rest his soul. He was such a character. While he couldn't necessarily do the indie moves, it was the personality that he
Right.
exuded with Casey Jackson, and that's why they were so popular. And by one Madman story is Adam pointed this out to me because I never noticed it. But if you watch the DVD, his shirts, it says "Whose house? My house." Well, someone didn't proofread for Madman because it's "Whose," WHO''S. So it really is saying "Who is house?"
Yeah.
My house. So I always like who is house is
That's
how I
right.
pronounce that. But again, a great match there, and of course the 5-star affair that is Pac and Generico.
Hmm.
Um, I think again, looking back on it for me, I think the commentary for me was so much better because I did sit back and I
Hmm.
let things happen, and Shane knowing the moves, knowing the calls,
Right.
being able to hit those and you're being able to do the play-by-play aspect of it, of the back and forth, and then literally everybody standing, including us, applauding that match after it was done was just that makes it worth the whole everything that happened up to that
Sure,
point.
absolutely. Um, Help me remember, who did Colt wrestle that night?
Colt wrestled 3G Eric Wayne,
That's right.
and that was right. So it was the women's match after intermission and going
Hmm.
to the second DVD. We have the women's match, which was our first women's match in AAPW. Probably it was in 4 years. The match itself was, what it was. You
Hmm.
move into the comedy show of Colt Cabana and 3G Eric Wayne. Eric is being the serious one. And there was a funny little spot of Eric Wayne threw his T-shirt at us and hit me in the face. So I throw the T-shirt back. He throws it at me. I throw it back in there, and then Colt does a fun little, again, just the improvisational skills of Colt Cabana were are second to none.
Yeah.
And so that was such a fun comedy match. And Colt putting over 3G was huge.
Yeah.
He could come in. Colt had no reason to do that. He came in because he wanted to put over local talent, and that's what he does. He brings in the fun. He brings in the fans as a name, but he put over 3G, and 3G was supposed to have a big impact on season two, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But that was a fun match in itself. And then we get, of course, to the sub main event with you and Mike Masters. And again, I will toot my horn on this one. The build up piece to that helped sell it for anybody who'd never watched anything of Collision.
Yeah.
You could see the story. You had the dramatic music to it.
Yeah.
That was it. Like The Rock does now.
Yeah.
The goosebumps thing.
Uh-huh.
It gave me goosebumps watching it again.
Yeah. Well, and going back to what you said about Colt Cabana and even uh, M Dog, Matt Cross, it wasn't until that night that I realized that, when you bring in a named talent, it makes sense for them. And, because I always thought in my head, oh, because I never knew what the results were going to be for the matches. I just assumed that, Poker Face was going to put over Mad Dog or M Dog, and that 3G would put over Colt Cabana. But then to me, and I may have been you, it may have been Golden. I don't remember who kind of explained it, but then it made sense. They're not going to be back next month, but 3G and of course we're going to get to the circumstances of why that didn't happen. But so you assume, you think the big name is going to come in there and dominate, but then it makes sense for them to put over that guy because they're going to come back and they've got that rub and more credibility leading into the stories that continue on with the show. So I never really thought about it until someone that night explained it to me, and it makes a ton of sense and a philosophy that I've obviously then seen put into motion in the future. So but good stuff there. And again, leading, the thing that kind of put a little bit of a damper at the end of the match with Mike Masters was him obviously getting split open and bleeding. And I can remember because you guys had said celebrate like crazy, go nuts. And as I was getting ready to do that, you're like, we got to get out of here. And I looked down
Mm-hmm.
and I had blood on my pants, and I'm like, am I bleeding? And then it wasn't until we got to the back and then I saw everybody kind of running out there to clean up the ring and to clean up Mike that he was the one who in fact was bleeding. So a little bit of a snafu, but a fun experience overall. And I think even Mike would to this day say that it was a good night for him too.
And to that point, I mean, let's talk about the match in itself. We've done that before, but just the psychology of it. Like, you're not a wrestler. There were no big spots in it. You did it as you should.
Yeah.
The match was planned out very well, where you get one shot in there, and then Masters just obliterates you. Then you get the shine for a brief moment, then you get cut down again, and then Masters grabs the chair, and that's when I come out and end up being the distraction, and then Jay comes in, and I know he feels terrible about it to this day,
Right.
but
Right.
there was the chair that they used was not one of those you consider a wrestling chair where it's easy to get hit on. This was a legit from a church basement
Yes.
metal chair
Yeah.
with a support brace on the back of the chair. And that's where Mike ended up getting hit,
Yeah.
was that support brace hit him in the head.
Mm.
And so we're going in there and celebrating, and all of a sudden Scott Wolf, as we're here, I'm looking down, and Scott's like, "No, go, he's hurt." Like, he's legitimately saying he's hurt. And
Yeah.
so that's when I'm still like, the smile kind of falters on my face. You can watch it on the DVD. Like, hey guys, we got to get out of here. And so that's when I usher you guys out, and you guys are celebrating around, and I'm running into the back trying to get help. And Mike ends up going to the hospital, getting stitches, and he came back actually afterwards,
Yeah.
fully stitched up, and we're again apologizing profusely. He's like, hey, this is what we do. This happens. And so
Yeah.
he took it well, and would lead into, actually, I think, one of the best stories that we told in season 2.
Yeah. And shout out to Mike, who just actually this month wrapped up his in-ring career, 23 years, I believe he said on online. So props to him and kudos to him. Someone that I have a tremendous amount of respect for. So I appreciate everything that he did. But again, we talked earlier about Edwin Livewire McGuire and Axe Allred too. If you were drafting a Mount Rushmore of AAPW wrestlers, I think those two guys have to be on that list.
Absolutely. And to go back really quick on Mike Masters, if I can add just one other
Sure.
thing before we move forward. Since then, I had so much respect for Mike. I mean, because he had pretty much been a part of my career since the
Oh yeah.
beginning, from the days at Rent One Park to AAPW, to where, the last show here in South Bend, Indiana,
Mm-hmm.
there was a local wrestler, Crippler Costello. He was actually WWF Enhancement Talent years ago.
Mm.
Um, he always would hold a match every year at our stadium, Four Winds Field. And so in 2023, what would end up being the last show we ever ran, long story short, I was built up as this heel announcer, and to the point of I would interfere in the main event of a match, and I ended, Axe from Demolition Axe,
Oh
or
yeah.
Demolition Axe from Demolition. I ended his career because he would, retire after, if he lost to Crippler Costello. And so that happens, and there's a whole storyline we're being told. So anyway, our the booker for that, Crippler, said, "Hey, we want to have you in this 6-man tag to finish this story." And I said, "Well, if we're doing that, I'd like to bring in 2 guys that I trust."
Mm-hmm.
The originally want to bring in Tyler Heath Hatton and Mike Masters, but he had an obligation and couldn't make it. I think it was Dog had a softball tournament
Mm-hmm.
that he was going to. So Jay came in, and so it's Jay, Mike Masters, and myself, and I go full Gaylord Stevens in this, where
Yes.
I put on just a funny getup and really channel him. So props to Gaylord Stevens, and allowing me to steal his gimmick for a night, but trusting Mike Masters and Jay to have my first match and my only match ever,
Yeah.
with Crippler Costello, Cowboy Bob Orton, and Barbarian.
Yeah.
And so that was just a phenomenal night, but I wouldn't have done it if I wasn't paired with guys that I trusted. Obviously I trust the guys on the other side, but I wanted guys on my side. So
Yeah.
a huge thank you to Jay, and of course to Mike for making that possible.
Yeah. And kudos to you for taking that superplex. Woo. I wouldn't have been able to do that, but yeah, good job on that. And I'm glad you brought that up, because I thought it was kind of fitting that it came full circle that you, Jay, and Mike were obviously all involved in that match that we had back at main event. So a full circle event for sure. But I love Axe Allred. I cannot say enough good things about him. He and Tyler, Heath Hatton, Mike Masters, Jay Spade, Farmer, Billy Hills. There's just a handful of guys that I resonate to and think about, not only from AAPW, but then also from Stride Pro Wrestling. But we're here to talk about main event and AAPW, and it just, the show ended, again, from my perspective, on a high note. And I was still worried about Mike, because I did wait and was, and again, this is before we had cell phones and stuff, but we weren't fully. And I remember his mom and his wife were not happy that night when they left the building. So I was kind of eagerly anticipating them returning or at least getting an update and whatnot. So I was preoccupied and not necessarily watching then the rest of the show, which you obviously then have to go back out and finish commentary for with Shane Rich. So talk to me about the main event and kind of the fallout after that.
The main event was everything. They had to try to outdo you guys.
Mm-hmm.
And as we're getting ready to start the main event, I'm like, wow, how are we going to top this? And I thought that the story that Ed and Axe told, I forgot about the El Camino incident where
Oh yeah.
Ed was hit by the El Camino prior to the show, and that was the story we told on the episode that aired that day. And so knowing Gaylord Stevens was going to come into it right away, it literally was a 2-on-1 handicap match for that. But they battled all over the arena. That was kind of the story that they had done before, but were able to tell now in front of a televised audience, a larger crowd. The shades of the whipping Ed with his belt, and then Ed getting the belt back and whipping him, and then all the referees getting knocked out. I mean, literally, you had everything else was thrown into that match.
Yeah.
With Ed, of course, coming out on top, and he's raising the belt high, and fans are getting ready to leave because the show ran long. Obviously, due to the nature of having to clean the ring up, partly, but there were 9 matches on the show.
Mm-hmm.
So the night ran long. I want to say it was probably close to 10:30 by the time, and we started at 7.
Yeah.
So it was literally a pay-per-view in that regard. So fans are already, you can see some fans are starting to get ready to leave while we're going off the air. So everything happens, and that the main event finishes, and things start to get hazy for me there as far as my memory goes, because I was just riding such a high and remembering certain things. So Ed finishes, he goes to the back, and we're starting to tear down. And that was when I wasn't actually, if I remember right, we ended up doing it in the promo room. It was, I remembered Sean, and I could be remembering wrong. So this is one person's recollection of the story. Sean might have a different version. Golden Boy might have a different version. Ed might have a different version. But there was a closed door meeting with Sean, Golden Boy, and myself, where Sean was taking the book away from Greg Anthony and giving it to Ed. It's Sean's company. That was completely his decision to make. I was just the guy putting it on TV, but Sean had me in as part of that the meeting.
Did you know this was going to happen?
I did.
Okay.
I knew that was part of what the anxiety that I had.
I got
going into main event was knowing that Sean was going to tell Greg after the show that Ed was getting the book. And Greg was rightfully upset by that.
Did Sean say why he was going to do that?
I don't recall why.
Okay.
I'm not sure if it was because he had promised Ed the book like a while ago, and then this all happened and moved forward. And the success that we saw, I don't know if it was because of the success that Sean wanted to keep it local. Again, Greg being from Tennessee,
right?
And in my head at the time, I agreed with Sean. Nothing against Ed. Looking back on it, that was the wrong decision. We had Golden Boy had a lot of great stories to tell. He had set the stage for a lot of things. We should have let him keep going. And that was the wrong move, looking back on it.
And we lost 3 great talents too, as a result.
Because Poker Face, 3G Eric Wayne, and Golden Boy all rode together.
Yeah.
And we lost some amazing talent for that. And I don't know what Sean's thoughts are to this day, if he has different thoughts, but I think that I respect every individual involved in this decision, but I think it was looking back on it, it was the wrong decision. And unfortunately, one that would be made again at the end of season 2.
Now, did you have a bad, not bad, but how did this impact your relationship with Golden Boy? Because I know eventually you ended up selling the AAPW ring to Golden Boy, I believe. Did you guys have a relationship after that or not?
We did. We had talked a little bit. Again, I think it was because it was Sean's company at the time. It was his decision to make. I don't think Golden Boy held that against me.
Yeah.
Again, it's the wrestling business. Things are going to happen.
Right.
I don't know how much Golden Boy and Sean have a relationship to this day, or to Golden Boy and Ed, but I mean, Greg and I still, every once in a great while, have talked. I still follow the things that he does.
Hmm.
But it was going into, such high hopes going into season two, and then this moment happens, and I'm thinking, oh God, what's going to happen now? Like, what are the stories that we're going to tell? But in my mind at the time, I'm thinking, well, maybe this will give me a little more freedom creatively to say, hey, let's do some of these things with the book.
Yeah.
Because after the fact, you remembered Adam, yourself, and myself. We had talked about what are the things that we can do, what are the storylines that we can tell. So that's when we started having a little more say as well. Even though Ed had final say,
Yeah.
we were able to come up with some ideas, and that's where the no limits, right behind me. That's where the no limits division came from.
Okay.
Realizing that was where we want to showcase some high flyers as well. It was the cruiserweight division from WCW.
Hmm.
That's where the no limits division from season two came about, and so we were able to have a little more say in season two. But again, Ed having final say on things, and I think part of that was what made things at the time feel a little easier for me.
Hmm.
That putting all this money into a show, but not really having a whole lot of say,
Yeah.
and now having a little more say in the style and what we were going to do moving forward.
Yeah. And, there was a pivot obviously made too, because if I remember correctly, that main event ends with Ed beating Axe Allward, but then Poker Face doing a run in at the very end. And so I believe, if I remember correctly, the story going forward was going to be Poker Face versus Ed for the championship. And
Correct.
a pivot was made. And, like you said, I think given the circumstances, going with Mike Masters and putting him in that feud with Ed afterward made sense, and it told a good story. But I think that after main event, I mean, I think that was the peak. And I'm not saying that that's when the wheels started coming off, but I do think it was different after that. Good or bad, it was different after that. And by the end of the year, AAPW ceases to exist in the form that we had known it as, and Pro Wrestling Collision is born. And we've gone 90 minutes already, but I don't want to go too much longer going into all of that stuff of it as well. But what are your final thoughts, kind of looking at the build up to main event happening, and then kind of the fallout, the aftermath from main event?
I think we could have an entire podcast dedicated to season two and moving forward
Yeah,
after that, because there's
that's
just so
good.
much to unpack. So
Sure.
I'd love to come back and talk if you
Yeah,
want to.
we'll do that. We'll absolutely do that.
Uh,
I think that's a great idea. Because again, this was not a get rich quick idea. This was not a money making endeavor or venture on your part. This was a passion project, and like you said, you were putting money up that you could have used to buy a house, you could have used to buy a car or invest in your future, or whatever, and you decided to provide. And calling a spade, not, no pun towards J Spade, but you gave a lot of people, myself included, an opportunity. You gave them, bucket list things that they could check off. You gave them, from the working side of things, but then the fans' perspective, you put a quality product on, you put your heart and soul into the editing and production and the promotion of it. So to you, thank you and kudos for that, because again, had it not been for Chris Hagstrom, obviously we wouldn't be sitting here talking about this and having this podcast. And who knows what other companies in Southern Illinois and in other parts of the state and the country would not be around, because that vision, that opportunity that was given, that we saw that Southern Illinois does in fact support and like independent wrestling. So thank you for that, my friend.
I appreciate that, and I'm thankful to have been a part of again, that lightning in a bottle, that show main event. It was something that I'll remember. January 14th has always been a very special. I don't know if it's cosmically special because my first because of the show itself. My first day with the South Bend Silverhawks, eventually South Bend Cubs, was on January 14th.
Oh, wow.
Um, the Cubs Con, when I got to actually touch the World Series trophy, happened on a January 14th.
Oh,
So
wow.
January 14th is cosmically significant for me,
Yeah.
and it all started with this. So I'm just incredibly thankful that I was able to work with folks that I did, and the show itself was something I will always remember, and kind of really gave me an opportunity to live out a dream. And so I thank Sean for that. I thank Golden Boy and all the boys who had allowed me to do that, and kind of didn't treat me like a money mark, to
Yeah.
use insider terminology.
Yeah.
They treated me like an equal.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, Chris, thank you again for your time. We will catch up soon and talk more about season 2 and more of AAPW, and then eventually maybe this is a 3-part series where we then dip into Pro Wrestling Collision as well. But I want to thank you again for your time and your support. Friends, I want to remind you also the Royal Rumble contest is underway. You can go to the Facebook page, get all the details, and get your entry into that. We will see you next time.